first met Carol at the 2023 Hideaway Hills fly-in when she was given the opportunity to fly in an aircraft like her dad would have trained in the States before shipping overseas, and very similar to the aircraft, the L4 Piper, that he flew in World War II.
Hi, I'm Fred Hawk, and I'm a commercial pilot and flight instructor, and I'm half owner in this aircraft, which is a 1943 Aeronca L3B, proudly made in Middletown, Ohio by a company that is still in existence and still in the aviation business today. They're known as Magellan Aerospace, and they make advanced products for military and civilian use. If you've flown on an airliner any time in the last 30 or 40 years, you've flown with Aeronca. We're going to go up today. This is going to be the first flight for Carol in a small aircraft of any kind, and it's going to be in an airplane, one of the types that her father flew while training here in the United States, but this is the L3B. It was flown by Army Artillery. It was also flown by members of the U.S. Army Air Forces as a, they call it a hack that would do all whatever missions they needed it to do.
What started as a late-night foray on the internet has evolved into a most wonderful and improbable journey, taking me back to learn more about my parents during World War II and General Patton's 4th Armored Division, sweeping through France in the summer, fall, and winter of 1944 and 1945. I discovered a moving and complicated love story that shaped the rest of my parents' lives as well as mine. Today I'll be telling you a bit of their story and my adventure discovering it, and the many surprises and wonderful people that I met along the way. The discovery started with my response to a few online skeptics about my dad's war accomplishments. The response led to finding his plane, several YouTube videos, a recently published book, and a full-page story in USA Today and other papers around the country, and a possible movie in the works. I hope you're intrigued because this is what the next hour is about. Let me begin with a short clip of a longer video that was shown at the EAA Air Show, an international organization of aviation enthusiasts. Each summer it puts on the largest show in the world with more than 800,000 people attending from all over the world. I was invited to participate and talk about my dad and his L4 plane, Rosie The Rocketer. Here's a portion of a much longer video that they showed.
Living in Moline, Illinois, 29-year-old Charles Carpenter was a high school history teacher. Carpenter was already a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Reserve and was called up for duty in March of 1942. He was sent to Miami Beach as an instructor to teach new officers how to be officers. With a younger brother who had been captured by the Japanese in the Philippines, Carpenter did not want to sit the war out in Miami. He volunteered to become a glider pilot and was sent to several bases in the southeast U.S. The glider pipeline was long, and as he was waiting his turn, he volunteered again to become a liaison pilot. He was sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where he earned his L-wings and was assigned the 4th Armored Division that was part of General Patton's 3rd Army. He arrived in England in early 1944 and by late May of 44 was assigned Piper L4H, serial number 4330426, which he would later add the nose art Rosie The Rocketer to the front left side in honor of the Rosie The Riveters back home in the States. While in England, he and his fellow pilots tested the use of bazookas that had been attached to the struts of the L4. He was not the first pilot to hang weapons on an L-bird, but he was almost certainly the most effective as using them. Arriving France on July 27, 1944, he began flying reconnaissance missions for General George Patton's 4th Armored Division. Flying over enemy lines, Charles would report back on the location of enemy tanks ahead of Patton's 3rd Army. It was dangerous work. In June and July 1944, General Omar Bradley's 1st Army, fighting in Normandy, lost 49 spotter aircraft with 33 pilots killed in action. Flying low and slow, unarmed spotter aircraft were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and even to small arms fire, and spotter pilots couldn't shoot back. That frustrated Charles Carpenter. In October 1944, alone, Charles Carpenter destroyed 4 enemy tanks and an armored truck with his little spotter plane and earned the nickname Bazooka Charlie. By the end of the war, Carpenter had received 2 Air Medals, 2 Silver Stars, a Bronze Star, and a promotion to Colonel for his bravery, creativity, and determination. He was officially credited with destroying 6 German tanks, making him a tank ace. And the Allied soldiers he fought alongside gave him one more nickname, the Lucky Major.
This all started about 20 years ago when I called my cousin Jean in New Mexico. We had completely lost touch since I was 12 years old. He was shocked when I called him out of the blue, but we quickly reconnected again. Because he knew about my dad and was interested in planes himself, he went to a large air show in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and saw an L4 Cub plane, not my dad's plane, but just like the one he knew that my father flew. He left a note on the owner's plane explaining that his uncle was Charles Carpenter, once known as Bazooka Charlie, and that his daughter lived in Ohio. He left my phone number, and then one day, Colin Powers, the man who had restored the plane, called me to say that he and his plane were going to be on display at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I brought my daughter and 2 grandchildren to see a plane like their grandfather once flew. Colin's plane won the International Heritage Award, and then he donated it to the Evergreen Air Museum in Oregon. Later, we worked together to create a display about my dad at the museum, and we've been good friends ever since. You will learn more about Colin and the role he played in the story in just a bit. And then one late night, a few years later, I was casually surfing the internet and decided to type in the name of my dad and Rosie The Rocketer. What popped up from the Great Plains Community Warbirds Forum website immediately caught my attention. Hi, I've got a reference I've been curious about. It concerns a Major Charles Carpenter, who reportedly went hunting German tanks in an Army's L4 Piper observation plane. Shooting bazookas from a Cub plane would be wildly inaccurate. Well, sorry, I just don't believe it ever happened. Others on the site added their own skeptical comments. I also have my doubts too. The complete lack of detail in the story makes me a bit skeptical. Someone else wrote, I'm inclined to dismiss it using a highly technical term, complete bullocks. I was irritated by their comments. I had never been very interested in my dad's war years, and he never spoke about them. But I remembered the big cardboard box of letters, photos, and newspaper clippings that my mother had saved, and I started to read them at 2 a.m. I answered back and posted the newspaper clippings full of details about my dad and Rosie. Their response was priceless and hugely satisfying. Well, it looks as if some of us have a trace of hen's ovulation to wipe off our face, but it's well worth it to uncover the real truth of an absolutely amazing story. Welcome to the forum, Carol. Holy living criminy, somebody wrote. This is a 5-star thread. Woohoo! Never underestimate those damn Yankees. When I told Colin about this experience, he suggested I write an article about my dad. He put me in touch with Jim Busha, the publication director of EAA, who offered to publish any article that I wrote about my dad, based on the letters and the clippings that my mom had so lovingly saved. The article became a lead story for the EAA Warbirds magazine. And then the most amazing thing happened. Joe Shields, a pilot living in Los Angeles and a staff person for the Collins Foundation, noticed the serial number on a photo of my dad's plane, and within a short time found my dad's plane, Rosie, in a museum in Graz, Austria. When he mentioned it to his wife, my name, she said, Carol Apacki, she used to be my Brownie leader. Joe wrote me a long letter after finding Rosie. I'm one of the people that works for the Collins Foundation in the effort of creating a living history museum collection. The photo of your dad really put the hook in me to find out more. His expression connected to me profoundly, and I could not stop thinking about him and the plane. I know that the plane was calling me to find her. Rosie was purchased by the Collins Foundation in Hudson, Massachusetts in October 2017 and brought back to the United States to be restored in Oregon by my friend Colin Powers, who, as it turns out, is well known for his restoration of vintage planes. He preserved the original bullet holes and other battle scars. My daughter Erin, who is a graphic designer, was asked by Colin to paint the nose art on her grandfather's plane. She did a beautiful job and met the high standards of the museum. After my writing the article, Jim Busha, the publications director from the EAA, called me and said, Carol, the story of your dad needs to be more than an article. I'd like to write a book with your help. When Jim came to interview me here in Granville, he assumed that I had only a handful of my dad's letters home. He describes what he saw instead. Scattered across a large dining room table, living room hutch, several end tables, couches, and living room floor were hundreds of handwritten letters spanning the years from 1941 to 1946. There were photo albums, scrapbooks, newspaper clippings, diaries, and handwritten poetry. To say I was dumbstruck is an understatement. We worked for a year on the book. Jim is both an aviation expert and a World War II historian. While he used my dad's letters extensively to tell the story, Jim also provides an invaluable historical context and overview of what was happening in the war. He did a lot of research on the side, actually visiting important places in my parents' lives. The story he wrote is far more than a book about war. It is also a tender but complicated love story about a newly married couple during wartime. I told Jim that the story had to be accurate. And when the book was published in May 2023, we were relieved to read the first review of the book on Amazon from Don Fox, a noted World War II author and historian. He described it as a magnificent work that he highly recommends because of the character depth and the author's knowledge of World War II and of aviation. In the summer of 2023, I was invited to talk about my dad at the EAA Air Show. The book was also presented. A daughter and 4 of my grandchildren came too. Jim told me that about 30 or 40 people might come to our presentation. My husband Ken counted 400 people. Let me tell you a bit about my mom and dad, the focus of the book. Both of my parents grew up in poverty with single moms due to alcoholic fathers. My father's father was a gambler and lost his 1,000-acre family farm in Illinois in a gambling game. After that, he completely disappeared from my father's life. One of my mother's most searing memories as a child was her dad coming home from heavy drinking and knocking over the Christmas tree. In dealing with her family's dysfunction, my mom developed an anxiety disorder, which the doctor called St. Vitus dance, and she dropped out of school in the 9th grade. As a teenager, my dad turned to books for inspiration and guidance. He thrived on the poetry and the great books and academic achievement. At 17 years of age, lacking a male role model, he wrote a creed for himself. And the creed was written as, "I have resolved to exert all of my efforts toward being a nobler and stronger fellow, a gentleman, a scholar, a friend, and a real man. To the best of my ability, I will ever strive to self-control, self-improvement, freedom, wisdom, courage, generosity, truth, and true nobility before God and men. I will be better." Charles Marston Carpenter, 1929. He was only 17 when he wrote that creed, and I think that this creed shaped the man my father was to become. And I'm guessing that my dad struggled during the war to hold on to the values that were so important to him. Perhaps this struggle helps to explain what was to come. Because of his athletic and academic abilities, my dad got a full scholarship to Center College in Kentucky. He was so poor, my dad stayed with the janitor during Christmas time due to the lack of funds to go home. After graduation, he returned to Moline, Illinois and became a high school history teacher. My mom lived at home with her mother and worked at the local licorice factory. Their lives merged in 1940 when they both attended the Coliseum Ballroom, where young singles came to dance to the big bands of Kay Kaiser's orchestra, Rudy Vallee, and others. They fell deeply in love, and within 3 months they had married because, as my mom told me, we had to get married because we were so in love, neither of us could eat. My dad lovingly referred to my mom as Bunny, and for the first time in her life, I think my mom felt secure, safe, and loved. Neither of them had any idea of the carnage happening a half a world away that would change their lives 17 months later. In 1940, our country created a program to help young men between 18 and 26 learn to fly. While still teaching, my dad received specialized training in aviation ground school, and he did his part to help our nation by becoming a ground instructor. My dad's younger brother, Gene, earned his wings as well and entered the Army and was soon stationed in the Philippines. Among the letters I found were several from Gene to his mother. "I can't tell you what I'm doing, but I'm still hitting on all 16 cylinders. Had my hair stand on end a couple of times, but if Providence is with me, I'll be home by November this year, or surely next. Keep your fingers crossed and your mind at ease, and it will all be over before you know it." In February 1942, he sent home a long poem that he had written, which he called a prayer. The last stanza is especially poignant. "The brains are on the rock, the soldiers in the field. MacArthur's miracle men are not about to yield. One last request I have, though I'm not afraid to die. Pray God death don't find me still here on Bataan, PI." I learned that on February 22nd, General MacArthur was told to leave Bataan. leaving behind Gene Carpenter and 15,000 other brave men who, without adequate food, withstood 11 Japanese attacks over 41 days. They were captured and forced by the Japanese to go on the Bataan Death March. Gene was put on a boat to Japan and died there in a prisoner of war camp. Soon after my grandmother Carpenter received a Blue Star, my dad headed off to war in March 1942, leaving behind my mom, who was pregnant with me. I was born a few months later. My dad's early letters to my mom were romantic, tender, and full of love. He was still in the United States in training and serving as a flight instructor. May 31st, 1942, he wrote, "Dearest Bunny, the more I see of life and people here, the more I love my life with you." March 6, 1943, "Dearest Bunny, I really am pleased to render service somewhere. I've been lucky all my life. I have more faith and confidence now than I've ever had. All evil comes to an end, even war, and the good has a way of smiling through." July 18th, 1943, "Sweetheart, I'm one of the luckiest guys in the whole world. One of the best breaks I ever got was when I captured you and later, through you, Carol Ann. If my luck doesn't wear out, I'll have you both for a long time." These are the kinds of letters that are typical of the letters that my dad wrote to my mom. And then in the summer of 1944, they take on a darker turn. He was shipped to England, and on July 11th, 1944, a month after the Normandy invasion, my dad landed on Utah Beach with General Patton's Third Army and General John Shirley Wood in command of the 4th Armored Division with the motto, "They shall be known by their deeds alone." They immediately entered into fierce combat as they began their sweep through France, pushing the Germans back and liberating towns. My dad flew reconnaissance in his small Piper Cub as a liaison pilot, spotting artillery and scouting the countryside for any trouble. His fabric-covered plane was only 700 pounds. And then in Aeronca in France, war correspondent Wes Gallagher detailed when the legend of my dad began.
Not one to just battle in the air, Charles was no stranger to combat on the ground. Near Aeronca, Carpenter was scouting landing sites. Spotted by Germans, his unit found themselves under attack. With the US forces battling for their lives, Charles realized the battle was going against them. In a battle rage, he climbed upon a Sherman tank and took control of a 50 caliber machine gun. Taking aim upon the enemy positions, Charles yelled all the while at the American troops to attack and press forward. Led on that day by the Mad Major shouting encouragement upon the Sherman, the Americans won the day and pushed the German forces back. A little too enthusiastically, Charles all the while continued firing, unwittingly striking an American Sherman bulldozer tank. The bulldozer blade of the tank was shot off by Charles, and he was placed under arrest for his perceived recklessness. Threatened with the firing squad, he was in mortal danger for his actions until his commanding officer intervened. Expecting to be court-martialed, in an incredible turn of events, General Patton himself saved Charles. Patton went on to admonish his men for arresting Charles, and instead of punishing him, he awarded the Major the Silver Star for bravery, saying that Carpenter was just the kind of fighting man he wanted in his army. The press loved the story of the Mad Major, and his fame grew. He was interviewed and told the reporters, "Some people around here think I'm nuts, but I just believe that if we're going to fight a war, we have to get on with it, 60 minutes an hour and 24 hours a day." By the end of the war, Charles had incredibly knocked out 14 tanks, but was officially credited with 6 tanks destroyed, including 2 of the feared Tiger Is. For his actions, he was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel.
His letter on August 5, 1944 took a dramatic and unexpected turn. I can only imagine the shock and heartbreak that my mother felt as she read it. "Dear Elda, brace yourself, because this letter will probably jolt you like hell. At present, I'm at a field medical unit well and sound, but bearing a tag that says battle, fatigue, and exhaustion in line of duty. Our advance has been rapid, and events have tumbled one upon the other. Someday I will tell you the whole story. Now I only want to tell you that I shall probably come out of the situation as a common soldier. Frankly, at present, the division authorities don't know what to do with me. I have done nothing that would disgrace my friends, my reputation, or my country. If anything, it is probably overzealousness of mine that has run rampant lately. As things appear from where I stand now, I shall probably not even return home at the end of the war. The old life is pretty much gone for me. Although you and home are as lovely and sweet as ever, from now on I must be free to speak my mind and follow what I believe to be the true course for the most concern. I shall continue to share with you all that I have. Other than that, much of your own destiny is in your own hands. Many men lose ideals in a war such as this. A few of mine have taken on a new luster. I have seen burning homes and needlessly devastated cities and villages. Amid scenes of confusion and panic, I did what I thought was right. In all cases, I've helped the situation. The individual should no longer count for much when so much else is at stake. I have become a very bad risk as a father and a husband. At times I am so restless and impatient that I scarcely know myself. Goodbye for now, and a lot of love to you and Carol Ann. Will I be proud of her someday too? Sincerely with love, Charles. Perhaps it was the threat of the court-martial that triggered such a letter. With his character now in question, bruised and battered, he couldn't imagine ever coming home again and returning to a normal life. But as you saw in the video, word about my dad spread like wildfire among the soldiers. And when word got back to General Wood, the commander of the 4th Armored Division, Wood was flabbergasted by what had happened to my father, and he rescued him by making Dad his personal pilot. It was General Wood, not General Patton, who rescued my dad. General Wood served in both World War I and World War II. He is most notable for training and commanding the 4th Armored Division, which spearheaded General George S. Patton's 3rd Army drive across France in 1944 during World War II. He earned the name Tiger Jack because when Patton would yell at him, Wood would pace like a caged animal and argue back. My dad flew General Wood over enemy lines so he could observe and provide direction. Wood shared the hardships of combat with his men, including living in a tent like the common soldier. Known for his outspokenness, he often challenged the decisions of his superiors. In frustration toward the end of the war, General Patton eventually sent him home for rest and recuperation. My dad deeply admired him, as did the men in the 4th Armored Division. My father and General Wood made a good team, except in a 700-pound plane, the two men made up more than half of the weight of the plane. My dad was 180 pounds, General Wood was 220. I can only imagine how unwieldy the plane was. When Dad wasn't taking General Wood to the front, he experimented with putting 2 bazookas on his plane, then 4, then 6, with 3 on each side. An AP reporter, Ken Coynion, wrote what it was like to fly in Rosie with my dad. A flight in Major Charles Carpenter's bazooka-shooting Cub observation plane is something like a ride in a roller coaster equipped with skyrockets. My plane isn't maneuverable with 2 people in it. As he flew over the front, he said, "There are 2 German tanks down there right now." Diving almost vertically to less than 300 yards of the ground, Carpenter fired 2 of the rockets, 1 from each wing. There was a flash of flame. Rosie stuck her nose up into the steep climb. "I allowed too much for the wind," the major grinned. Again the Cub dived and 2 rockets flashed groundward to a massive German Panther tank. Black puffs of anti-aircraft shell spotted the sky. And with that, Rosie turned leisurely back to her hillside pasture landing field for another load of gas and rockets. It was when my dad was flying solo that his legendary deeds continued.
20th of September 1944, the Battle of Aeronca, France. German panzer forces had launched a strong attack against advancing US forces near the city of Nancy, and some units of the 4th Armored Division are pinned down. Taking off in thick fog, Major Charles Carpenter heads for the battle. The fog clears about lunchtime, and Carpenter espies a column of German tanks and vehicles moving on Aeronca. Diving down, he launches his attack. Does Carpenter drop bombs? No. Does he strafe the columns with 50 cals? No. Instead, he fires 6 bazooka rockets at the rumbling Panther tanks before shearing away and heading home to rearm. What were bazookas doing being fired from an aircraft? What the Germans don't realize is their column is being assailed by a man nicknamed Bazooka Charlie, flying not a fearsome beast of aerial warfare, but a slow, fixed undercarriage artillery spotter plane, a Piper Cub grasshopper with the interesting name Rosie The Rocketer emblazoned on its side. Major Charles Carpenter was a pilot serving with the U.S. Army's 1st Bombardment Division in France. His job entailed piloting his L4H Piper Cub spotter plane on artillery support and reconnaissance missions over German lines. Carpenter did his job well, calling in artillery to support U.S. infantry and armored divisions. But his little plane was unarmed, and this began to bother and annoy Carpenter. With constant targets presenting themselves down below and the artillery not always able to hit them quickly enough, Carpenter decided to do something himself. Weaponizing a grasshopper was a tricky business, its low takeoff weight vitally important for short landings and takeoffs in fields within the battle zone. Carpenter decided initially upon a pair of bazooka rocket launchers. The anti-tank weapons were attached to specially designed brackets screwed onto the wing's jury struts. The weapons were loaded and the firing mechanisms wired to a panel in the cockpit so that Carpenter could fire them remotely and in any sequence. Carpenter conducted a series of tests with the pair of bazookas against ground targets, the grasshopper able to swoop down low at extremely slow speed, enabling Carpenter to take aim and fire. The bazookas were angled at 30 degrees, and the rocket's hollow charge warhead could happily punch through 3 inches or 76 millimeters of armor plate, making many German armored fighting vehicles vulnerable, particularly from flank, rear, or in this case, top bazooka strikes. Carpenter christened his plane Rosie The Rocketer and increased his armament to 6 bazookas, 3 under each wing. Carpenter now had the means and the will to start dishing out his own brand of trouble. The Mad Major, or Bazooka Charlie as Carpenter was quickly christened, soon found some juicy targets. He would locate a German tank from higher altitude and then descend rapidly, making a short attack run and releasing his bazooka rockets, hopefully on the target. Bazooka Charlie was credited with destroying or immobilizing 4 German tanks, 2 noted as Tiger 1s, and an armoured car. In the normal scheme of things, Carpenter's Piper Cub was not shot at by German troops because it would reveal their positions to the enemy. But once Carpenter started rocketing their vehicles, this policy was reversed, and the Mad Major faced rifle and machine gun fire as he made his attack runs. The attack he launched on a column of Panther tanks on the 20th of September 1944 was notable for its persistence. After giving the Germans all 6 rockets, he returned to base, reloaded his bazookas, and then flew back to the German column, firing another full load at the enemy armor. Then, incredibly, Carpenter returned again, reloaded, and flew back through a storm of lead to rocket the German column for a 3rd time. He received official credit for immobilizing 2 Panthers and several other German armored vehicles.
Okay. To add to the story, I read in a clipping that there was an American support crew trapped under the bridge, and my dad's attack forced the remaining German tanks to retreat, enabling the trapped crew to escape injury and capture. But for all the headlines, the poetry my dad was writing showed the deeper pain of war that he was experiencing. One of the few stories my dad told me was about landing in a field and getting out of his plane, only to see 4 German soldiers walking toward him from the woods. My dad was unarmed and he thought, well, this is it, I'm a dead man. To his utter amazement, the soldiers put up their hands in surrender. Here is an excerpt of a poem that he wrote about it. The other day I met one of those we fought in a dark and shattered wood. I had come to see what death our fire had wrought, and face to face we stood. Flames crackled from the wreckage all around. The stench of burning flesh was in the air. His rifle was cast upon the ground, and I, surprised, could only stare. He nodded wearily at my stern command and bent to search his soldier's bag. He tossed aside a knife, a pistol, a shining hand, and his face lit up at one small rag. It was a baby thing, blue and partly burned. He folded it and kicked his loaded rifle. I led him from that torn and stinking spot, and willing guards took him to the prison lot. He smiled at me and wrongly guessed me free. And then my dad's letters start to take a new and even darker turn. My poor mom. February 6th, 1945. Dearest Bunny, this time I'm writing from an Army evacuation hospital. I have never felt better. However, there is a swelling on one side of my neck that has the doc puzzled. Dad was moved to a hospital in Paris where he had an operation on his neck. He wrote, "A growth has been removed from beneath the muscle on the right side of my neck. As you would guess, I'm relatively undisturbed." Further treatment was recommended, and my dad was sent home to Walter Reed General Hospital in the United States. And it was there that he was told by several doctors that he had only 1 year to live with a diagnosis of Hodgkin's disease. April 10th, 1945. Dearest Elda, yesterday almost a dozen of your letters arrived from overseas. They carried the same story of faith in me and our future. The war may have hardened and coarsened me, but the war for me was an absurd and tragic farce. My greatest moments of pity were for the helpless and innocent people ground to bits between our opposing armies. The point is that I have changed more than I let you know. For my part, much of my idealism has slipped through my fingers and disappeared. I have made friends that you would find difficulty in accepting. I have been unfaithful on more than one occasion and thought scarcely anything of it. Money has run through my fingers like dirt. You and Carol have often been little more than a dream of my past and little part of my future. The thought of nothing after death but dreamless sleep is pleasant to me. Perhaps I'm no longer a refuge or a rock to build upon. I am hungry for the loveliness of you and home, but there is a deeper hunger and pain that I'm sure cannot keep me there. I'm no hero, and I dread any appearance in Moline in that role. This letter will probably hurt you more than it should. You have not failed in anything. I am in conflict with life and myself, and telling you about it so you may be forewarned and take steps to look out for your own interest, as well as our common interest. What followed are many more letters from various hospitals. He wrote, "It must be hard on you to have my status changing so from day to day. Your voice sounded so fresh and eager yesterday that I wanted to reach across the hundreds of miles and hold you very close." In December 1945, he was still in the hospital, receiving surgeries and treatments and signing his letters with lots of kisses and good nights. A week later, he wrote, "My face is badly swollen and I look like I have had mumps. The doctor says if it all goes well, I might be able to make it home by Christmas." As I read the letters that I know caused my mom so much pain and made for such a heartbreaking time for both of them, I'm quickly reminded that the story has a happy ending. Even though I was only 3 years old when my dad finally came home, I remember that Christmas well. I was sitting under the tree, surrounded in gifts, probably opening of gifts, throwing the paper around, and my dad just stormed out of the room, seeing me as a spoiled child after seeing so many children suffering in France. I didn't like him all that much. He was quite stern and remote, unlike my gentle, loving mother, who had given me her sole attention. Now with my dad home, I didn't get the attention from my mom that I had before. I probably saw him as an intruder. Our early years together were shaky at best. With the diagnosis of Hodgkin's confirmed and given about a year to live, my dad decided he was going to enjoy life. He wanted to see the American West, and so we rented out our home in Moline, bought an Airstream trailer, and headed out west for several months, visiting friends and family along the way. After several months of travel, we headed back to Illinois to prepare for death. But he was feeling fine and beginning to heal, and so did their marriage. They bought an old brick house near the University of Illinois campus in Champaign, Illinois, so that someday I could easily and affordably go to college. Not sure what to do next, my dad got his master's and was still feeling fine and began to heal emotionally. He took a job teaching history at a nearby high school, thinking that it might be very short term. Each year at Christmas time, my dad had surgery to remove another inflamed lymph node. But he always recovered, and for the rest of the year, he lived an active, satisfying life and continued teaching history for 25 years. Even though the dark shadows of death hung over us, I was able to grow up with loving parents. I realize now that it was my mom who held our little family together. Even though she was shy and retiring, she had a fierceness of spirit that often shined through. To educate herself, she got her high school degree through correspondence school, often with my dad at her side, guiding her through algebra problems. My mom loved to dance and make fun, and when I was a child, she read to me from the Book of Knowledge to instill a curiosity that is with me still. And while she lacked the intellect of my dad, she brimmed with common sense and a non-judgmental, generous spirit. My dad was a deeply respected high school history teacher who had the school yearbook dedicated to him. The image of my dad as Bazooka Charlie is one that is very different from the person I knew. I knew him as a scholar. He read widely, collected great books, loved and sang operetta in the shower, and carried on serious discussions about philosophy and history. He was a poet, a practical joker, and an athlete. He was a gentle husband and father who patiently taught me chess, tennis, and regularly took me on nature walks and on camping and canoe trips. He spent long hours with me in deep conversations about books and big ideas. In the summers, my dad ran a boys' camp in the Ozarks, a camp that focused on teaching outdoor skills and building character. The counselors who served with him at the camp are now in their late 70s. They are now writing a book about him and the profound influence that he had on them as young men who strive to live by the high standards that my dad had once written down in his creed. One of these counselors, now in his 80s, told me that he keeps my dad's pictures on his desk and that he looks at it every day as an important role model in his life. I think what I'm really trying to say is that his war deeds as Bazooka Charlie with Rosie The Rocketer were only a small part of who he was and the legacy he left. My dad died in March 1966. I had just returned from the Peace Corps and my father fell on the basketball court while playing a vigorous game. And his health took a dip and Hodgkin's disease finally won out. My mother and I spent the last 2 months visiting him in the hospital. I had long, loving conversations with him, still seeking his insights and advice. Sadly, I never asked him about his war years. One day he took turn for the worse, and in true style, died with a book of poetry on his chest. Students wrote a tribute to him in the yearbook. They wrote, "Perhaps that it is impossible to do Mr. Carpenter justice. He was a war hero who never spoke of the war, a rugged athlete who also wrote poetry, a gentleman who spoke with tolerance and wisdom. This he was, and more." After my dad died, my mom became a Christian Scientist and learned how to overcome her insecurities and health issues. She took some college courses in early childhood development. Later, she moved here to Granville, Ohio, to be closer to me and to our family. She worked as a teacher's assistant at Montessori schools for several years, well into her 80s. She studied every morning the teachings of Mary Baker Eddy and didn't go to a doctor ever again. On the day before she died at 88, my daughter Mary Kay and I went to see her with Mary Kay's 2 small children. My mother held the youngest, chatted happily with us, and served us summer strawberries. As she stood on the porch and waved goodbye, I said to my daughter, "Doesn't Grandma look beautiful?" The next morning, I found her lying on her bedroom floor. She had passed away on my father's birthday. I like to picture my father coming for her with outstretched hands and saying, "Bunny, it's time to come home." There were still some strawberries left in the refrigerator and the boxes about my dad's war years in her closet. This has been an amazing journey for me and a gift at this stage of my life to be able to put it together and make sense of all the bits and pieces of memories, photos, newspaper clippings, all of which my mother lovingly saved. Most recently, I had a wonderful opportunity to complete my journey of discovery by going to see my dad's plane Rosie at the Collins Foundation in Hudson, Massachusetts. I met Joe Shields on my left, the man who traced Rosie the Rocketer back to Austria, and Rob Collins, the founder of the Collins Foundation, who purchased Rosie and brought her back to be restored. He's on my right there. By utter coincidence, the day we arrived at the museum, Rosie was in a World War II reenactment battle scene, flying over German tanks amidst artillery fire, just as she had done more than 80 years ago. I got to see Rosie both in the air and close up. I feel as though the story of my dad and Rosie has now come full circle, with so many questions answered about my parents' lives during World War II. I've also learned that heroes come in many forms. My dad left the military as a lieutenant colonel and had many medals to acknowledge the brave deeds that he did. But I realized that my mom was as much a hero as my dad. In fact, it was my mom who held things together as my dad was falling apart. I'm guessing he had PTSD, a condition not addressed in World War II. Like many women during wartime, she carried on. But most of all, my own children and grandchildren now know this story, and they too have learned that even the best of lives can be full of ups and downs, sadness and regret, but that people can recover. Heartbreaking things can happen, and mistakes are made, but love and forgiveness can prevail and lead to happy endings with inspiring stories to share with your family and friends, and now with all of you. Thank you.
V8, Hawkeye Drive V8.